In a bustling children's hospital in downtown Seattle, a single father's gentle magic would soon capture the heart of America's most powerful tech CEO. But first, he had to win an impossible bet that would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Seattle Children's Hospital cast their familiar harsh glow across the pediatric ward's waiting area, where Robert Conklin sat hunched over a worn leather briefcase, carefully arranging an assortment of colorful silk scarves and small wooden props. At 34, Robert carried the weight of single fatherhood in the gentle lines around his eyes and the careful way he moved through the world, always aware, always watching for the next challenge that might test his resolve. His calloused hands, marked by years of construction work before he'd discovered his true calling, moved with surprising delicacy as he prepared for his weekly volunteer shift. The transformation from hard-hat-wearing contractor to children's entertainer hadn't been planned, but life rarely asked for permission before it rewrote your story. 3 years ago, when his 8-year-old daughter Emma had spent 2 months in this very hospital battling pneumonia, Robert had watched countless children struggle with fear, pain, and the overwhelming sterility of medical treatment. That's when he'd first pulled a quarter from behind a crying boy's ear, watched wonder replace terror in those small eyes, and realized he'd found his purpose. The art of magic, he'd learned, wasn't about the tricks themselves. It was about creating moments where impossible things felt possible, where sick children could forget their circumstances and remember what it felt like to believe in wonder. Robert had thrown himself into learning every technique he could master, studying under retired stage magicians, practicing for hours after Emma fell asleep, perfecting illusions that could work in the confined spaces of hospital rooms and wheelchairs. His Tuesday afternoon routine at Seattle Children's had become as essential to him as breathing. He'd arrive at 2 o'clock sharp, check in with the nursing staff, and spend the next 4 hours moving from room to room, bringing smiles to faces that had forgotten how. The nurses knew him by name now, often calling him when a particularly difficult case needed that special touch only Robert seemed to possess. Today felt different, though. The head nurse, Patricia Williams, had approached him with unusual urgency as he'd signed in. "Robert, we've got a situation in the VIP wing," she'd said, her voice carrying the strain of someone who'd been dealing with a challenging case. "There's a little girl, Victoria, who's been here for 3 days. Routine appendectomy turned complicated. She hasn't spoken since the surgery, won't eat, barely acknowledges anyone. Her mother is—" Patricia had paused, choosing her words carefully. "Influential. And frustrated. Very frustrated." Robert had nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Wealthy families often struggled differently with their children's medical crises. Used to controlling outcomes through resources and connections, they could become difficult when faced with situations that money couldn't simply fix. But a child's fear was universal, whether they lived in a mansion or a studio apartment. "What makes this case special?" Robert had asked, adjusting the strap of his briefcase. Patricia had glanced around, then leaned closer. "The mother is Diane Harrington, Harrington Technologies? She's been here practically around the clock since Victoria was admitted, trying everything. Specialists, therapists, even flew in a child psychologist from New York. Nothing's working. This morning she actually said—" Patricia had hesitated, then continued. "She said she'd pay anything to anyone who could make Victoria smile again." Robert had felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced when he'd first decided to learn magic for Emma's sake. It wasn't about money. He'd never charged for his hospital visits and never would. It was about the challenge, about a child who needed what he had to offer. Now, as he made his way toward the VIP wing, Robert reflected on how far he'd come from those early days when magic had been just a desperate father's attempt to distract his sick daughter. He'd discovered he had a gift for reading children, for understanding what each individual young patient needed to feel safe, to feel hopeful. Some needed grand illusions that made them gasp with surprise. Others needed gentle, intimate magic that made them feel special, chosen. And a few needed something deeper, magic that helped them believe they had power over their own circumstances, that they weren't just victims of whatever medical crisis had brought them here. The VIP wing, operated on a different frequency than the rest of the hospital. The rooms were larger, quieter, with real artwork on the walls instead of cheerful but institutional prints. As Robert approached room 314, he could hear voices through the partially open door, a woman's voice, crisp and commanding, speaking in the measured tones of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I understand your position, Dr. Peterson, but there has to be something else we can try. In my business, when conventional solutions fail, we innovate. We find new approaches." Robert paused outside the door, recognizing the desperation beneath the controlled exterior. He'd heard it before. Parents who were used to solving problems, suddenly confronted with their own helplessness. "Mrs. Harrington," came the doctor's patient reply, "Victoria's physical recovery is progressing exactly as expected. What she's experiencing is psychological trauma, which is common after unexpected surgical complications. Sometimes, children need time to process." "Time?" The woman's voice sharpened. "She hasn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. She won't speak to me, won't even look at me. I've built a company from nothing, solved problems that industry experts said were impossible, and I can't help my own daughter?" Robert knocked gently on the doorframe, then stepped into view. The conversation stopped abruptly as 3 adults turned toward him. "Drive." Peterson, a woman in an expensive silk blouse whose bearing screamed executive authority, and a tired-looking man in a rumpled suit who could only be the father. "Excuse me," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying the calm confidence he'd developed through countless similar moments. "I'm Robert Conklin, the children's entertainer. Patricia mentioned there might be a young lady here who could use a visitor." Diane Harrington's eyes swept over him, taking in his modest clothes, his working man's hands, the humble briefcase that certainly didn't look like it contained anything that could solve her current crisis. Robert was used to that look, the initial skepticism of people who equated value with price tags and credentials with diplomas. But it was the small figure in the hospital bed that captured his attention. 7-year-old Victoria Harrington lay curled on her side, facing away from the room's occupants, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. Even from behind, Robert could read the body language of a child who had retreated so far inside herself that the outside world felt dangerous. This, he realized, was going to require every skill he'd ever learned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning routine at Robert Conklin's modest apartment in the Ballard neighborhood had become a carefully choreographed dance of necessity and love. Every weekday at 6:30 a.m. sharp, he would wake his daughter Emma, pack her lunch with the same attention to detail he brought to his magic performances, and walk her the 6 blocks to Roosevelt Elementary before heading to his day job at Morrison Construction. Robert's calloused hands, which could expertly operate a pneumatic drill or frame a wall with precision, possessed an almost supernatural delicacy when it came to the art of illusion. His small living room had been transformed into a practice space where silk scarves hung from carefully placed hooks, where mirrors were positioned at exact angles to help him perfect his sleight of hand, and where dozens of small props lived in organized chaos across every available surface. The transition from construction worker to magician hadn't been planned, but rather born from desperation during the darkest period of his life. When Emma had been hospitalized with pneumonia 3 years ago, Robert had watched his normally vibrant 8-year-old daughter retreat into silence, overwhelmed by the machines, the needles, the constant parade of medical professionals. Traditional comfort hadn't worked. Not stories, not toys, not even his terrible dad jokes that usually made her giggle. But then, in a moment of pure desperation, he'd attempted the only magic trick he remembered from his own childhood: making a coin disappear behind someone's ear. Emma's eyes had widened for the first time in days, and something had shifted in both of them. That night, while she slept, Robert had stayed up until dawn watching YouTube tutorials, determined to master every technique he could find. What started as a father's desperate attempt to help his sick child had evolved into something much deeper. Robert discovered he possessed an intuitive understanding of what each child needed. Not just entertainment, but genuine connection. Some kids responded to grand illusions that made them gasp with wonder. Others needed gentle, intimate magic that made them feel special and chosen. The sickest children often needed something more profound: magic, that helped them believe they still had some power over their circumstances. His philosophy was simple but profound. Every child deserved to experience wonder, especially those whose worlds had been reduced to hospital rooms and medical procedures. Magic wasn't about fooling people. It was about giving them permission to believe in possibilities beyond their current reality. The head nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital, Patricia Williams, had become both friend and collaborator over the past 2 years of Robert's weekly volunteer visits. She understood that what Robert offered couldn't be prescribed or administered through an IV. It was healing of a different sort, the kind that touched hearts rather than treating symptoms. "You have a gift," Patricia often told him, watching as children who had been withdrawn and frightened would light up at Robert's gentle presence. "It's not just the tricks. You see them, really see them, not as patients but as whole people." Robert's approach was methodical yet intuitive. Before entering any room, he would speak with the nursing staff to understand each child's personality, their fears, their current emotional state. A shy child might need a quiet trick performed just for them. An angry child might need magic that let them participate, giving them a sense of control. A scared child might need wonder that was so beautiful it momentarily erased their fear. His collection of props had grown sophisticated over the years, each piece chosen for its ability to work in the unique environment of a hospital. Silk scarves that could transform into flowers, small wooden puzzles that revealed hidden compartments, specially designed card tricks that worked even when performed from a child's bedside. Every item in his briefcase had been tested not just for its magical effect, but for its ability to bring genuine joy to children facing unimaginable challenges. The construction work paid the bills, but Tuesday afternoons at the hospital had become the hours that gave Robert's life meaning. He would finish his shift at Morrison Construction, race home to shower and change, then carefully pack his briefcase with the day's selected illusions. Emma, now 11 and fully recovered, had become his biggest supporter and harshest critic, often helping him practice new routines and offering brutally honest feedback on what worked and what didn't. "Dad," she would say with the wisdom of a child who had experienced real fear, "when you're scared, you need magic that makes you feel brave, not just surprised." Robert carried that insight with him into every hospital room. He wasn't just performing tricks. He was offering children a different way to see themselves and their circumstances. In a world where they often felt powerless, he gave them moments where impossible things happened, where wonder was still possible, where they could be amazed rather than afraid. His reputation at the hospital had grown quietly but steadily. Nurses would specifically request his presence for difficult cases. Doctors had learned to work around his Tuesday schedule, understanding that what Robert provided often accomplished what medical intervention alone could not. But Robert remained humble about his abilities, understanding that his gift wasn't really about the magic itself. It was about presence, attention, and the profound human need to feel seen and valued. Every child he visited taught him something new about resilience, about hope, about the incredible power of simply showing up with genuine care and attention. The worn leather briefcase that accompanied him everywhere contained more than props. It held the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of interactions with children facing their greatest challenges. Each silk scarf, each carefully crafted wooden puzzle, each specially designed illusion represented Robert's commitment to bringing light into the darkest moments of young lives. As he prepared for what would become the most important performance of his life, Robert couldn't have known that his simple philosophy of service was about to collide with a world of corporate power and unlimited resources, creating ripples that would transform not just 2 lives, but an entire understanding of what healing could look like. The antiseptic silence of room 314 was broken only by the gentle hum of medical equipment and the barely audible sound of a child's shallow breathing. Robert stood in the doorway, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read the emotional temperature of a room within seconds of entering it. Victoria Harrington lay motionless in the hospital bed, her small frame dwarfed by the pristine white linens and the array of monitoring devices that surrounded her. Her dark hair fanned across the pillow, and even in profile, Robert could see the pale complexion and hollow look that spoke of a child who had retreated so far inward that the outside world no longer seemed to exist for her. Diane Harrington stood beside the bed like a sentinel, her designer clothes immaculate despite what were clearly days of constant vigil. Everything about her posture screamed control and competence, yet Robert recognized the subtle signs of a parent at the end of their rope. the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted between her daughter and anyone who entered the room, searching desperately for solutions that hadn't yet materialized. Dr. Peterson, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, stepped forward with the weary professionalism of someone who had delivered difficult news to countless families. "Mrs. Harrington, this is Robert Conklin, the volunteer entertainer Patricia mentioned. He's worked wonders with some of our more challenging cases." The man Robert assumed was Victoria's father remained silent in the corner, his expensive suit wrinkled from days of hospital vigil. Unlike his wife's controlled intensity, he radiated the quiet desperation of someone who had already accepted his own helplessness in the situation. "Mr. Conklin," Diane's voice carried the crisp authority of boardroom negotiations. "I appreciate your willingness to try, but I should be clear about what we're dealing with. Victoria underwent what should have been a routine appendectomy 4 days ago. There were complications, internal bleeding that required additional surgery. Since then, she's spoken perhaps 10 words total, refused most meals, and shows no interest in any form of interaction or entertainment." Robert nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Victoria's still form. He had encountered this before. Children so overwhelmed by medical trauma that they essentially shut down, creating a protective barrier between themselves and a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and frightening. "We've tried everything," Diane continued, her voice betraying the first crack in her composed facade. "Child psychologists, therapy animals, her favorite toys from home, even had her best friend visit yesterday. Nothing. It's as if she's—" She paused, struggling with the words. "As if she's decided to just disappear." Robert set his briefcase down quietly beside the visitor's chair, his movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. "Mrs. Harrington, may I ask you something? Before the surgery, what made Victoria laugh?" The question seemed to catch Diane off guard. She blinked, as if having to reach back through days of medical crisis to remember her daughter as anything other than a patient. She loved surprises. Little unexpected things. I used to hide notes in her lunchbox, or rearrange her stuffed animals while she was at school so she'd find them in funny positions when she came home. And what about magic? Had she ever shown interest in magic tricks? Diane's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Actually, yes. There was a magician at her friend's birthday party last month. Victoria was absolutely mesmerized. She kept asking how everything worked, trying to figure out the secrets behind each trick. She's always been like that. Curious, analytical, too smart for her own good sometimes." Robert felt a spark of recognition. Analytical children often responded well to magic that invited participation, rather than passive observation. Tricks that made them feel like collaborators rather than mere audience members. But with Victoria's current state, he would need to be extraordinarily careful about his approach. "Mrs. Harrington," Robert said quietly, "would you mind if I spent some time just sitting with Victoria? No tricks, no performance, just presence." Diane's eyebrows rose slightly. In her world, problems were solved through action, through doing something. The concept of strategic inaction was foreign to her executive mindset. "I don't understand. How is sitting going to help?" "Sometimes," Robert explained, settling into the chair beside Victoria's bed. "Children who have experienced trauma need to feel safe before they can feel curious again. Trust comes before wonder." He opened his briefcase, not to remove props but simply to let Victoria see, if she was paying attention, that something new had entered her environment. The leather case was worn smooth from years of use, and as it opened, the faint scent of cedar wood and silk escaped into the sterile hospital air. For the next 20 minutes, Robert simply sat. He didn't speak to Victoria, didn't try to engage her, didn't perform any tricks. Instead, he quietly arranged a few simple props on the bedside table, not as a performance, but as a gentle introduction of color and texture into the stark medical environment. A silk scarf the deep blue of ocean water, a small wooden box with intricate carved patterns, 3 silver rings that caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. Diane watched this non-activity with growing frustration. "Mr. Conklin, I don't mean to be rude, but—" Robert held up a gentle hand, his eyes still focused on Victoria. Because in that moment, he had seen what Diane had missed. The almost imperceptible shift in Victoria's breathing, the way her eyes had moved, just slightly, toward the items on the table. "Victoria," Robert said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I brought some things with me today. They're just sitting here if you'd like to look at them. No pressure, no performance. They're just here." The silence stretched, but it was different now, charged with possibility rather than heavy with despair. Victoria's eyes remained closed, but Robert could sense the change in her awareness, the way a good performer learns to feel the attention of their audience even in darkness. Diane started to speak again, but Robert caught her eye and shook his head almost imperceptibly. This was the crucial moment, the space between withdrawal and curiosity, between safety and risk. Pushing too hard now could undo whatever fragile connection was beginning to form. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, Victoria's eyes opened. Not the full engagement Robert hoped for eventually, but a crack in the wall she had built around herself. Her gaze found the blue silk scarf, followed its gentle movement as the air conditioning stirred it slightly. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was the first sign that Victoria Harrington was still in there, still reachable, still capable of curiosity despite her fear. And Robert Conklin, master of small wonders, settled in to do what he did best: create space for miracles to unfold in their own time. The slight flutter of Victoria's eyelashes as she focused on the blue silk scarf was like watching a flower begin to bloom after a long winter. Robert felt the familiar stirring of hope that came with these breakthrough moments, but he forced himself to remain perfectly still, understanding that trust was as fragile as spun glass and twice as easily shattered. Diane had opened her mouth to speak again, but something in Robert's posture, the way he leaned slightly forward, the intensity of his focus, made her pause. Even Dr. Peterson seemed to sense the delicate nature of what was unfolding, taking a step back to give the moment room to breathe. Victoria's eyes, dark brown like her mother's but lacking any of Diane's fierce determination, moved slowly from the scarf to the carved wooden box. Her breathing had changed, becoming less shallow, more present. Robert recognized the signs, a child testing the waters of engagement, checking to see if the world was safe enough to rejoin. "The box is interesting, isn't it?" Robert said, his voice so soft it was almost lost in the hum of the medical equipment. "It was made by an old craftsman in Vermont, who believed that every piece of wood had a story to tell. This particular piece came from a maple tree that had been struck by lightning but survived." Victoria's eyes didn't move toward Robert, but he saw her pupils dilate slightly, the unconscious response of someone listening despite themselves. It was a technique he had learned through trial and error. Children who had withdrawn often responded better to stories about objects than direct attempts at conversation. "Would you like to know what's special about it?" Robert continued, still speaking to the air rather than directly to Victoria. "It's not what you might think. It's not a trick box or a puzzle. It's something much more interesting than that." For the first time since he had entered the room, Victoria's head moved. Just a slight turn, barely perceptible, but enough that Robert knew she was actively listening now, rather than simply enduring his presence. Diane, meanwhile, was struggling with every instinct in her body. As CEO of Harrington Technologies, she was accustomed to taking charge, to driving outcomes through force of will and strategic action. Watching this slow, gentle approach unfold went against everything she understood about problem-solving. Yet she couldn't deny that in the space of 20 minutes, this quiet man with his simple props had accomplished more than teams of specialists with their advanced degrees and expensive interventions. "The thing about this box," Robert continued, reaching slowly for it and placing it gently on the bed beside Victoria's hand, "is that it only opens for people who are brave enough to believe in impossible things. Not magic tricks, mind you, real impossible things." Victoria's fingers, which had been motionless for days, twitched almost imperceptibly toward the box. Robert pretended not to notice, understanding that any acknowledgement of her movement might cause her to retreat again. "I've carried this box with me for 2 years now," he said, beginning to weave the kind of story that had proven most effective with traumatized children, one that gave them agency while acknowledging their struggle. "I've met hundreds of kids, and do you know what I've discovered? The bravest ones aren't the ones who aren't scared. The bravest ones are the ones who are terrified but decide to trust anyway." Dr. Peterson exchanged a meaningful glance with Diane. In 4 days of constant medical attention, they had not seen Victoria respond to anything with this level of engagement. Whatever Robert was doing, it was reaching her in ways that traditional therapeutic approaches had failed to achieve. The last little girl who opened this box, Robert continued, had been in the hospital for 6 weeks. She was scared, angry, and had decided that the world wasn't safe anymore. Sound familiar? He paused, letting the parallel settle without pushing it. But she taught me something important. She said that sometimes, when you're really scared, the only way to feel brave again is to do one tiny, impossible thing. Victoria's hand had moved closer to the box, though she still hadn't touched it. Robert could see the internal battle playing out across her young features, the desire to engage warring with the fear that had kept her safe in her cocoon of silence. "You know what she told me after she opened it?" Robert's voice carried just enough warmth to feel inviting without being overwhelming. "She said it wasn't the magic inside that mattered. It was deciding to believe that magic was possible again." The room held its breath as Victoria's fingertips finally made contact with the wooden surface. The touch was feather-light, exploratory, as if she was testing whether this small act of curiosity might somehow make her more vulnerable to the pain she was trying to avoid. Diane felt tears prick her eyes for the first time since this ordeal had begun. Her daughter, brilliant, precocious Victoria, who had always been fearless in her pursuit of knowledge, was fighting to find her way back to the world one tentative touch at a time. "The beautiful thing about impossible things," Robert said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine conviction, "is that they don't require you to stop being scared. They just require you to be curious enough to take one small step forward." Victoria's entire hand was resting on the box now, and Robert could see her mind working behind her eyes. The same analytical intelligence her mother had described, slowly engaging with the puzzle he had presented. Not the mechanical puzzle of how the box opened, but the deeper question of whether she was ready to risk believing in wonder again. "Would you like to try opening it?" Robert asked, finally addressing her directly but keeping his voice as gentle as a whisper. "There's no pressure. It will wait for you as long as you need it to wait. But if you're curious, if you think you might want to see what's inside, all you have to do is believe it's possible." The silence that followed felt different from the heavy quiet that had characterized Victoria's withdrawal. This was expectant silence, pregnant with possibility. Even the medical equipment seemed to hum more softly, as if the machines themselves were holding their breath to see what Victoria would choose. Robert understood that this moment was about far more than opening a wooden box. It was about a traumatized child choosing to risk engagement with a world that had hurt her. It was about trust, curiosity, and the profound courage required to step back into life after trauma had made existence feel dangerous. Whatever Victoria decided in the next few moments would determine not just whether Robert's intervention succeeded, but whether a brilliant little girl would find her way back to herself. Victoria's fingers traced the intricate carved patterns on the wooden box with the delicate precision of a scientist examining a new discovery. The room around them seemed to fade into background noise as her analytical mind, the same brilliant intelligence that had made her the youngest student ever admitted to the gifted program at Lakeside Academy, began to engage with the puzzle Robert had presented. "It feels warm," she whispered, her voice so soft that everyone in the room leaned forward instinctively. These were the first words she had spoken in 36 hours, and they carried the tentative quality of someone testing whether the world was safe enough for communication. Robert felt his heart skip, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Wood holds warmth differently than other materials," he explained, matching her whisper. "This particular piece has been handled by many people over the years. Some say it remembers every touch." Diane pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back tears at the sound of her daughter's voice. The man in the corner, Victoria's father, James, stepped closer to the bed for the first time since Robert had arrived, his own eyes bright with cautious hope. Victoria's exploration of the box became more confident, her fingers finding hidden grooves and subtle variations in the carved surface. Robert watched her work with professional appreciation. She had the methodical approach of someone who understood that complex problems required patient investigation. "There are no visible hinges," Victoria observed, her voice gaining strength as her curiosity overcame her fear, "but the wood grain suggests a seam here." She pressed against a particular section, and nothing happened. Instead of frustration, Her expression showed the focused concentration of someone enjoying the challenge. "What do you think the secret might be?" Robert asked, pulling his chair slightly closer to the bed. The movement was calculated, close enough to show investment in her success, but not so close as to feel invasive. "It's not mechanical," Victoria said with growing confidence. "At least not entirely. The patterns, they're not just decorative, they're instructions." Her finger traced a spiral carved into the lid. "This moves inward, toward the center. And this one," she found another pattern, "moves outward." Dr. Peterson found herself genuinely fascinated by the child's analytical process. In 4 days of medical interaction, Victoria had responded to questions with monosyllables at best. Now she was demonstrating the kind of complex reasoning that had always been her trademark. "You're a natural puzzle solver," Robert said with genuine admiration. "I've seen grown-ups struggle with that observation for hours." For the first time since the surgery, Victoria's lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile. "I like puzzles. They have rules, even when you can't see them at first. Everything else," her voice faltered slightly, "everything else can change without warning." The profound insight hit everyone in the room simultaneously. Victoria wasn't just recovering from surgery. She was grappling with the fundamental realization that life could become unpredictable and dangerous without any warning at all. The puzzle box offered her something she desperately needed: a challenge with discoverable rules in a world that had suddenly seemed chaotic. "That's exactly right," Robert said, his voice carrying deep understanding. "Puzzles are honest. They don't change the rules halfway through. And when you solve them," he paused meaningfully, "when you solve them, you know you figured it out yourself." Victoria finished, her hands moving more confidently across the box's surface. "You know you have the power to understand things, even when they seem impossible at first." Diane felt a chill of recognition. Her daughter was describing exactly what had been taken from her by the medical crisis, the sense of personal agency, of being able to understand and influence her own circumstances. The surgery had made her feel powerless, vulnerable in ways her young mind had never experienced. Victoria's exploration had become more systematic now, testing different combinations of pressure points and movement patterns. Robert could see her brilliant mind, mapping the possibilities, eliminating variables, building hypotheses about how the mechanism might work. "Try thinking about it like a story," Robert suggested. "Every good story has a beginning, a middle, and an ending. What if the box wants you to tell it a story with your hands?" Victoria paused, considering this new framework. "A story," she murmured, then began to move her fingers in a different pattern entirely. Instead of treating the carvings as mechanical elements, she began to trace them as if they were chapters in a narrative. Her finger started at a small carved flower near one corner, a beginning. Then followed a winding path that led through various symbols: a bird in flight, waves suggesting water, a sun with radiating lines. Finally, her finger came to rest on a carved star at the box's center. As she completed the pattern, something shifted inside the box with the softest click imaginable. Victoria's eyes widened as the lid lifted slightly, revealing a warm golden glow from within. "I did it," she breathed, and for the first time since before her surgery, Victoria Harrington looked truly, genuinely pleased with herself. "I actually did it." "You absolutely did," Robert confirmed, his own voice thick with emotion. "And you know what the most amazing part is? No one else could have opened it exactly the way you did. Every person finds their own path through the story." Victoria lifted the lid fully, revealing the box's contents: a small crystal prism that caught the afternoon light and threw tiny rainbows across the hospital room's white walls. But more than that, nested beneath the crystal was a piece of paper with elegant handwriting. "What does it say?" Victoria asked, holding up the note. Robert leaned closer, as if reading it for the first time, though he had written it himself just that morning. "It says, the real magic was never in the box. It was in the courage to believe that impossible things are just problems waiting for the right person to solve them." Victoria looked up at Robert for the first time since he had entered the room, her dark eyes bright with intelligence and something that had been missing for days: hope. "Are you really a magician?" she asked. Robert smiled, recognizing that this question was about far more than career identification. "I'm someone who believes that magic happens when brave people decide to trust their own abilities, even when they're scared. Does that count?" Victoria considered this seriously, then nodded. "I think, she said slowly. "That might be the most important kind of magic there is." The transformation in the room was palpable. Victoria was sitting up straighter, engaging directly, her analytical mind fully reactivated by the successful solution of Robert's puzzle. But more importantly, she had taken the first crucial step back into a world where she could trust her own capabilities. Robert understood that the real magic wasn't in his wooden box or carefully crafted illusions. It was in creating space for a brilliant, traumatized child to rediscover her own power. The crystal prism in Victoria's hands transformed the sterile hospital room into something resembling a fairy tale. As she turned it slowly in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, rainbows danced across the white walls, the medical equipment, and the faces of everyone watching. For the first time in days, the room felt alive with wonder rather than heavy with worry. "The physics are actually quite simple," Victoria said, her voice gaining strength as she slipped back into the comfortable territory of analysis and explanation. "White light contains all the colors of the spectrum, but they travel at slightly different wavelengths. When the light passes through the prism, it separates into its component colors because each wavelength refracts at a different angle." Robert nodded appreciatively, recognizing that Victoria's need to understand and explain was part of her healing process. "That's exactly right, but knowing how it works doesn't make it any less beautiful, does it?" "No," Victoria agreed, creating a particularly brilliant rainbow on the ceiling above her bed. "Sometimes understanding something makes it more beautiful, not less. Like—" She paused, working through a thought. "Like knowing that stars are actually massive nuclear fusion reactors doesn't make them less magical when you look up at the night sky." Diane felt her chest tighten with a mixture of relief and love. This was her daughter, brilliant, curious, always ready to dive deep into the mechanics of how things worked. The child who had spent hours as a toddler taking apart her toys just to see what made them function, who had taught herself basic coding at age 5, who approached every new concept like a puzzle waiting to be solved. "Victoria," Robert said gently, "would you like to see what happens when we combine the prism with this?" He reached into his briefcase and withdrew the blue silk scarf she had first noticed. "Sometimes magic is about discovering what happens when you bring different elements together." Victoria's eyes lit up with the kind of anticipation she usually reserved for science experiments. "What kind of combination?" "Well," Robert said, positioning himself so Victoria could see everything he was doing, "what do you think might happen if we let the light pass through the prism and then through the silk?" This was Robert's special gift. Not just performing magic, but making children active participants in creating wonder. Instead of simply showing Victoria a trick, he was inviting her to hypothesize, to predict, to engage her scientific mind in the process of discovery. "The silk fibers would probably scatter some of the light," Victoria reasoned, sitting up straighter in her bed as her analytical mind fully engaged. "And depending on the weave density and the material, it might create interesting patterns or diffusions in the spectrum." "Only one way to find out," Robert said with a smile, holding the scarf so that the prism's rainbow passed through it. The result was stunning. The colors became softer, more diffused, creating an ethereal glow that seemed to float in the air like captured aurora borealis. "Oh!" Victoria gasped, her scientific prediction giving way to pure delight. "It's like the light is dancing!" Dr. Peterson found herself equally mesmerized by the display, but more importantly, by Victoria's transformation. The child who had been virtually catatonic just an hour ago was now sitting up, engaging, asking questions, and displaying the kind of intellectual curiosity that had always been her defining characteristic. "The really interesting part," Robert continued, adjusting the angle of the scarf to create different effects, "is what happens when you become part of the magic yourself." He handed Victoria the silk scarf. "Try moving it slowly through the light. See how you can control the patterns." Victoria took the fabric with reverence, as if she understood she was being entrusted with something precious. As she began to move it through the prism's rainbow, her face transformed with concentration and joy. She experimented with different movements, fast, slow, circular, linear, watching how each motion created unique light patterns. "I'm conducting light," she said with wonder, "like a symphony, but with colors instead of music." "Exactly," Robert agreed. "And just like a conductor, every movement you make creates something that's never existed before. No one else will ever create exactly the same patterns you're making right now." The metaphor resonated deeply with Victoria. After days of feeling like things were happening to her, surgery, complications, medical procedures she couldn't control, she was suddenly creating something beautiful, something uniquely her own. James, Victoria's father, stepped closer to the bed for the first time, his voice thick with emotion. "Sweetheart, that's incredible. You're making magic." Victoria looked up at him, and for a moment, the family resemblance was striking, the same intelligent eyes, the same thoughtful expression. "Not magic, Dad. Science." "But maybe," she paused, considering, "maybe the most beautiful science feels like magic." "Perhaps," Robert suggested gently, "the difference between science and magic isn't as big as people think. Both are about discovering what's possible in a world full of wonders we haven't understood yet." As Victoria continued to play with the light and silk, creating increasingly complex patterns, Robert began to introduce additional elements from his collection. Small mirrors that could redirect the rainbows, pieces of colored glass that added new hues to the spectrum, even a simple kaleidoscope that showed Victoria how her light creations could be multiplied into infinite patterns. Each new element was presented not as a trick to be watched, but as a tool for Victoria to explore and master. Robert understood that for a child like Victoria, brilliant, analytical, accustomed to understanding how things worked, the magic wasn't in being mystified, but in being empowered to create mysteries of her own. "You know what I think?" Victoria said after 20 minutes of experimentation, her voice stronger than it had been since before her surgery. "I think magic is just science that hasn't been explained yet. And science is just magic that someone figured out how to teach." Robert felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Victoria wasn't just recovering her curiosity, she was integrating her traumatic experience into a broader understanding of how wonder and knowledge could coexist. She was teaching herself, through play and exploration, that understanding the mechanism behind something didn't diminish its capacity to inspire awe. "That," Robert said with genuine admiration, "might be the wisest thing anyone has ever said about magic." Victoria beamed, and for the first time since her surgery, she looked like herself again, confident, curious, ready to tackle any puzzle the world might offer. The prism in her hands continued to throw rainbows around the room, but the real transformation was happening in the brightness returning to her eyes. The transformation happening in room 314 was nothing short of miraculous. Victoria had gone from withdrawn and silent to animated and engaged, orchestrating light symphonies with her prism and silk scarf while explaining the scientific principles behind each effect. The rainbow patterns dancing across the walls seemed to reflect the return of light to her own spirit. "Look what happens when I hold the prism at this angle," Victoria said excitedly, adjusting her position to create a particularly stunning cascade of colors across the ceiling. "The spectrum shifts because I'm changing the incident angle of the light. It's like I'm painting with physics." Robert watched with deep satisfaction as Victoria's natural teaching instinct emerged. She had begun explaining each discovery to her parents, her voice gaining confidence with every observation. This was more than recovery. This was Victoria reclaiming her identity as a brilliant young scientist who saw wonder in understanding. "Victoria," Robert said gently, "I have something special I'd like to share with you, something that combines everything we've been exploring together." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew what appeared to be an ordinary deck of cards, but as he fanned them out, each card caught the light from Victoria's prism, revealing that they were printed on a special holographic material that shimmered with iridescent patterns. "Rainbow cards," Victoria breathed, immediately understanding the connection to their light experiments. The surface coating must be designed to refract light into spectral patterns. "Exactly right," Robert confirmed, "but these cards are special for another reason. They only reveal their true magic when someone brave enough to believe in impossible things decides to work with them." Victoria set down her prism carefully, her analytical mind already racing ahead to the possibilities. "What kind of magic?" "The kind that proves you have more power than you realize," Robert said, beginning to shuffle the deck with fluid, practiced movements. "Victoria, I want you to think of a number between 1 and 10. Don't tell me what it is. Just hold it in your mind." As Victoria concentrated, Robert continued shuffling, but his movements weren't random. He was performing one of the most sophisticated techniques in close-up magic, a series of false shuffles and cuts that appeared to randomize the deck while actually maintaining precise control over the order of the cards. "Now," Robert said, spreading the cards face down in a perfect arc across Victoria's hospital table, "I want you to count that many cards from the left and touch the card that lands on your number. Remember, I have no idea what number you chose." Victoria's eyes narrowed with scientific curiosity. She was clearly trying to work out how this could possibly lead to anything other than random chance. After a moment's consideration, she counted carefully from the left side of the arc and placed her finger on the 7th card. "Perfect," Robert said. "Now, before we turn that card over, I want to show you something." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope. "I wrote a prediction before I came to visit you today. Inside this envelope is the exact card you just selected." "That's impossible," Victoria said, but her tone carried excitement rather than skepticism. "You shuffled the cards randomly, and I chose my number freely. There's no way you could have predicted." "Why don't you open the envelope and see?" Robert suggested, handing it to her. Victoria tore open the envelope with the eagerness of a scientist about to confirm or refute a hypothesis. Inside was a single card, the same holographic material as the deck, but this one showed a beautiful rainbow pattern in the shape of a butterfly. Written across the bottom in elegant script were the words, "The 7 of Rainbows." "Now," Robert said gently, "would you like to turn over your chosen card?" Victoria flipped over the 7th card from the left and gasped. It was identical to the card from the envelope, the 7 of Rainbows, with its shimmering butterfly pattern that seemed to move in the light. "How is that possible?" Victoria demanded, but her voice carried delight rather than frustration. "I chose the number freely. You couldn't have known." "Ah," Robert said with a mysterious smile, "but what if I told you that you didn't choose 7 at all? What if you actually chose the number that was always meant to be chosen?" Victoria stared at him, her brilliant mind working through the possibilities. "You're saying it wasn't random chance?" "I'm saying," Robert replied, gathering up the cards with practiced ease, "that sometimes what we think is coincidence is actually the universe working exactly as it should. Sometimes the magic isn't in controlling the outcome. It's in trusting that the right outcome will reveal itself." The metaphor hit Victoria with unexpected force. For days, she had been struggling with the randomness of her medical crisis, the way her appendix had suddenly become a threat, the way complications had emerged without warning. But here was a different way of thinking about unpredictability, not as chaos to be feared, but as possibility to be embraced. "So you're saying," Victoria said slowly, working through the implications, "that even when we can't control everything that happens to us, we still have the power to choose how we respond." "What do you think?" Robert asked, understanding that Victoria needed to reach this conclusion herself rather than having it explained to her. Victoria looked down at the 7 of Rainbows in her hand, its holographic surface catching the light from her prism and throwing tiny rainbows across her palm. "I think," she said thoughtfully, "that maybe being brave isn't about not being scared. Maybe it's about choosing to believe in beautiful possibilities, even when you can't see how they're going to work out." Diane felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched her daughter's face. Victoria wasn't just recovering from her medical trauma, she was growing from it, developing a deeper understanding of resilience and possibility that many adults never achieved. "That," Robert said with profound respect, "is exactly right. And Victoria, I want you to keep that card, not as a magic trick, but as a reminder that you have the power to choose wonder over fear, curiosity over withdrawal, hope over despair." Victoria clutched the card to her chest, and for the first time since her surgery she smiled. Really, truly smiled. "Thank you," she whispered, "not just for the magic, but for helping me remember who I am." Robert felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was why he did this work, why he spent his Tuesday afternoons in hospital rooms instead of earning overtime at the construction site. These moments of transformation, when a child rediscovered their own light, made everything worthwhile. The rainbow butterfly on Victoria's card seemed to flutter in the shifting light, a perfect symbol of transformation, beauty emerging from change, and the magic that happened when brave young minds chose to embrace possibility over fear. The atmosphere in room 314 had transformed so completely that it felt like an entirely different space from the one Robert had entered 2 hours earlier. Victoria sat cross-legged on her hospital bed, the 7 of Rainbows card in one hand and her prism in the other, creating intricate light patterns while explaining the physics behind each effect to anyone who would listen. The change was so dramatic that nurses had begun stopping by just to witness what they were calling The Miracle in 314. Dr. Peterson stood in the doorway, reviewing Victoria's chart with barely concealed amazement. In 20 years of pediatric medicine, she murmured to herself, I've never seen a psychological breakthrough this rapid or this complete. But it was Diane's reaction that would prove most significant. She had been watching Robert work with the intense focus she usually reserved for board meetings and product launches, her executive mind analyzing every technique, every word choice, every moment of connection. What she was witnessing challenged everything she thought she understood about problem solving, about healing, about the kind of intervention that could create real change. Mr. Conklin, Diane said, her voice carrying the crisp authority that had made her one of the most feared negotiators in Silicon Valley, might I have a word with you privately? Robert glanced at Victoria, who was now showing her father how to angle the prism to create a rainbow on the far wall. Of course, Mrs. Harrington. They stepped into the hallway, where Diane's composure began to crack for the first time since this ordeal had begun. What you've done in there, she said, her voice tight with emotion. What you've accomplished in 2 hours. We've had teams of specialists working around the clock for 4 days. Child psychologists, trauma therapists, pediatric psychiatrists, and none of them got so much as a word out of her. Robert nodded quietly, understanding that Diane was processing more than just her daughter's recovery. Sometimes, he said gently, healing doesn't happen through intervention. Sometimes it happens through invitation. I need to understand how, Diane said, and Robert recognized the tone. This was a CEO identifying a problem that needed solving, a methodology that needed acquiring. What you did in there wasn't just entertainment. It was therapeutic intervention of the highest order, but delivered through, she struggled for the words, through magic and wonder, instead of clinical technique. Mrs. Harrington, Robert began, but Diane held up a hand. Please, let me finish. I've built Harrington Technologies into a billion-dollar company by recognizing paradigm shifts before my competitors do. What I just witnessed represents a fundamental breakthrough in how we think about healing, about therapy, about helping children process trauma. Her eyes were bright with the kind of intensity Robert had seen in venture capitalists when they identified the next big investment opportunity. I don't think you understand what you've stumbled onto here, Diane continued, beginning to pace in the small hallway space. The applications are limitless. Pediatric hospitals, trauma centers, therapy practices, special needs education. You've developed a methodology that combines psychological insight with wonder-based intervention in ways that traditional approaches can't match. Robert felt a familiar uneasiness beginning to stir in his chest. He had encountered this before, well-meaning people who wanted to systematize, scale, and monetize what he did. Mrs. Harrington, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but what happened in there wasn't a methodology, it was just human connection. Exactly. Diane's voice rose with excitement before she caught herself and lowered it again. You've found a way to create authentic human connection that transcends the clinical barriers that often prevent traditional therapy from reaching children like Victoria. Do you realize how revolutionary that is? Through the window of Victoria's room, Robert could see the little girl teaching Dr. Peterson how to hold the prism to create specific color patterns. Her transformation was complete and genuine, but he knew it had nothing to do with replicable techniques or scalable methodologies. Mrs. Harrington, Robert said carefully, I'm honored that you think what I do has value, but I'm not sure you're understanding the nature of the work. What happened with Victoria was specific to her, to this moment, to her particular needs and personality. It's not something that can be packaged or systematized. Diane's expression shifted, and Robert saw the negotiator emerge. Mr. Conklin, I'm going to be direct with you. I want to offer you a position with Harrington Technologies, not in our main business. We develop educational software and learning platforms. But I want to create an entirely new division focused on therapeutic applications of wonder-based intervention. The words hit Robert like a physical blow. I'm sorry, what? Think about it, Diane pressed on, her voice gaining the momentum of a practiced pitch. We could develop training programs, create standardized approaches, build technology platforms that could deliver this kind of intervention to children all over the world. Instead of helping one child at a time, you could help thousands, tens of thousands. Robert's mind reeled. Mrs. Harrington, I don't think you understand. What I do isn't a job. It's a calling. I volunteer at the hospital because children need what I offer, not because I'm developing therapeutic techniques. And I work construction to pay my bills because that's honest work that doesn't compromise what I do here. But imagine the impact you could have. Diane's eyes were bright with vision and possibility. We could fund research into the psychological mechanisms behind wonder-based therapy. We could create training centers, develop certification programs, build a whole new field of therapeutic intervention. At what cost? Robert asked quietly. The moment what I do becomes a product, a service, a methodology to be scaled and optimized, it stops being what it actually is. One human being caring deeply about another human being's well-being. Diane paused, clearly not having anticipated this resistance. In her world, bigger was always better, broader impact was always the goal, and scaling successful innovations was simply logical business practice. "Mr. Conklin," she said, her tone shifting to something more personal, "my daughter hasn't smiled in 4 days. In 2 hours you've given her back her curiosity, her joy, her sense of agency in the world. How can you not want to share that gift with as many children as possible?" The question hung in the air between them, and Robert found himself facing a dilemma he had never anticipated. How do you explain that some gifts lose their power when they're systematized? How do you preserve the authentic human connection that makes healing possible, while still reaching children who desperately need help? Through the window, Victoria's laughter rang out as she successfully created a rainbow that perfectly framed her father's face. The sound was pure joy, untainted by any agenda other than the simple pleasure of discovery and connection. Robert realized that his answer to Diane's offer would determine not just his own future, but potentially the future of every child who might benefit from what he had learned to offer. The weight of that responsibility was both inspiring and terrifying. The weight of Diane's offer settled over Robert like a heavy blanket as they stood in the hospital corridor, the sounds of Victoria's renewed laughter drifting through the doorway behind them. For a man who had never imagined his simple acts of service extending beyond the walls of Seattle Children's Hospital, the prospect of helping thousands of children was both exhilarating and deeply unsettling. "Mrs. Harrington," Robert said slowly, "I need you to understand something. What happened with Victoria today wasn't the result of a technique I learned or a method I developed. It was the result of seeing her, really seeing her, and responding to what she needed in that specific moment." Diane's expression remained focused, intense. "But surely there are principles underlying what you do. Decision-making frameworks, observational skills, ways of reading children's emotional states. Those elements could be taught, couldn't they?" Robert found himself thinking of his daughter Emma, of those desperate nights in this very hospital when he had first discovered that magic could be medicine. The principles, maybe. But the heart of it? He shook his head. "I don't think that can be taught. I think it can only be lived." "Then we teach people to live it," Diane said with the kind of determination that had built her technology empire. "We create an environment where caregivers can develop that kind of authentic connection. We support them, train them, give them the tools and the time to really see the children they're working with." Despite his reservations, Robert felt a stirring of possibility. "What exactly are you proposing?" Diane's eyes lit up as she recognized his willingness to engage. "A comprehensive program. We start with pediatric hospitals, not replacing traditional therapy, but supplementing it. We train volunteers in wonder-based intervention techniques, create supportive technology platforms, develop assessment tools to help match the right approach to the right child." "You're talking about institutionalizing magic," Robert said, and for the first time there was a hint of amusement in his voice. "I'm talking about democratizing healing," Diane corrected firmly. "Right now, children like Victoria only get access to what you offer if they're lucky enough to be in the right hospital on the right day when you happen to be volunteering. That's not sustainable. And it's not fair." Robert glanced back through the window at Victoria, who was now attempting to teach Dr. Peterson a simple card trick she had improvised using the rainbow deck. The sight of her animated face, so different from the withdrawn child he had encountered just hours earlier, made Diane's argument impossible to dismiss entirely. "What would my role be in this hypothetical program?" Robert asked. "Master trainer, program developer, the keeper of the philosophy that makes this work." Diane's voice carried the excitement of someone outlining a vision she could clearly see. You would work with our team to identify the core principles behind effective wonder-based intervention. We'd bring in child psychologists, educational specialists, technology developers, but you would be the guiding force, ensuring we never lose sight of what actually matters. And you think this could work? You think magic can be scaled without losing its magic? Diane paused, considering the question seriously. I think, she said carefully, that we have to try. Because the alternative is accepting that healing like Victoria's remains random and rare. And I'm not willing to accept that. Robert felt the familiar internal tension he experienced whenever his simple calling collided with larger possibilities. Part of him was deeply attracted to the idea of helping more children, of expanding beyond the limitations of his Tuesday afternoon volunteer shifts. But a larger part feared that systematizing his approach would inevitably corrupt it. Mrs. Harrington, can I ask you something? Robert said. When you look at what happened with Victoria today, what do you see? I see breakthrough intervention that achieved in hours what traditional approaches couldn't accomplish in days, Diane replied immediately. And that's exactly what worries me, Robert said gently. Because when I look at what happened today, I don't see intervention at all. I see relationship. I see a scared little girl who needed someone to meet her where she was and invite her back into the world at her own pace. Diane's expression shifted slightly as she processed this distinction. Are you saying the difference matters? I'm saying the difference is everything, Robert replied. The moment we start measuring success by speed of recovery or efficiency of technique, we stop seeing the children as whole human beings and start seeing them as problems to be solved. They were interrupted by Victoria's voice calling from her room. Mr. Robert, can you come show my dad how to do the rainbow butterfly effect? He's not getting the angle right. Robert smiled, recognizing the imperious tone of a child who had fully reclaimed her confidence. Duty calls, he said to Diane. As they returned to Victoria's room, Robert found himself observing the scene with new eyes, trying to imagine how what he did might translate to a broader program. Victoria was now the acknowledged expert on prism effects, directing her parents and Dr. Peterson with the authority of a young professor. Her transformation was complete, but more importantly, it was authentic. She hadn't simply returned to her previous state, but had grown through her experience. Mr. Robert, Victoria said as he approached, I've been thinking about your card trick, the 7 of rainbows appearing in both places. I have a theory about how it worked. Oh? Robert said, settling back into his chair beside her bed. I think you used multiple forcing techniques to ensure I would select the 7th position, but made it feel like free choice by giving me control over the number selection process, Victoria said with the satisfaction of someone who had solved a particularly challenging puzzle. Robert grinned, delighted by her analytical breakthrough. And what do you think about that? I think, Victoria said thoughtfully, that sometimes the most beautiful magic is when someone cares enough about you to create the illusion of coincidence. Like the universe conspiring to make something wonderful happen just for you. Diane, listening to this exchange, felt something shift in her understanding of what Robert offered. This wasn't just therapeutic intervention. It was the creation of experiences so carefully crafted, so personally meaningful, that they became transformative memories a child could carry forward. Mr. Conklin, she said quietly, I think I'm beginning to understand what you've been trying to tell me. Robert looked at her expectantly, waiting to see if she had truly grasped the essential nature of his work. This isn't about scaling magic, Diane continued. It's about creating environments where magic can naturally occur, not replicating your specific techniques, but fostering the conditions that allow for authentic human connection and wonder. For the first time since her offer had been made, Robert felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps, Diane Harrington might understand how to honor the heart of what he did while expanding its reach. The conversation that would reshape Robert's understanding of possibility took place in the hospital's family conference room 3 days later. Victoria had been discharged that morning, her recovery complete and her spirits fully restored. But the impact of her transformation had rippled through Seattle Children's Hospital in ways no one had anticipated. Eat it. Dr. Peterson sat across from Robert and Diane. A stack of incident reports and patient feedback forms spread before her. In 48 hours, she said, her voice carrying a mixture of amazement and professional excitement, we've had more requests for your services than we typically receive for any therapeutic intervention in a month. The word had spread through the hospital's informal networks. Nurses talking to other nurses, families sharing stories in waiting rooms, staff members witnessing the dramatic change in Victoria's condition. Parents were asking specifically for, quote, the magician who helped the Harrington girl, and other children were requesting visits from the man with the rainbow cards. We've had to create a waiting list, Dr. Peterson continued, and that's unprecedented for a volunteer program. Robert felt a familiar discomfort with the sudden attention. Dr. Peterson, I appreciate the confidence, but I'm already at capacity with my Tuesday schedule. I can't possibly see more children without compromising the quality of the interactions. Which brings us back to the question of expansion. Diane interjected, but her tone was different now, less aggressive, more collaborative. The past 3 days had given her time to process Robert's concerns about institutionalizing his approach, and she had clearly been refining her proposal. I've been doing research, Diane continued, pulling out her tablet and swiping through what appeared to be extensive notes. There are currently over 180 children's hospitals in the United States, serving approximately 6 million pediatric patients annually. Traditional therapeutic services are overwhelmed, understaffed, and often ineffective with trauma cases. She paused, meeting Robert's eyes directly. But I've also been thinking about what you said, about the danger of turning relationship into methodology, and I think I understand now how we might bridge that gap. Robert leaned forward, genuinely curious about what Diane had conceived. We don't scale you, Diane said simply. We scale the opportunity for people like you to exist and thrive. The distinction was subtle but significant, and Robert felt his resistance beginning to shift. What does that mean practically? It means we create a foundation, not a business, a foundation that identifies and supports individuals who have natural gifts for wonder-based healing. We don't try to teach people to be you. We find people who already are like you and give them the resources, training, and support to do this work. Dr. Peterson leaned forward with interest. Like a fellowship program? Exactly, Diane nodded. We develop rigorous selection criteria based not on credentials or education, but on natural empathy, authentic presence, and the ability to create genuine connection with children. Then we provide comprehensive support, training in child psychology, safety protocols, age-appropriate techniques, but always in service of enhancing their natural gifts, not replacing them. Robert found himself intrigued despite his reservations. And the goal would be? One wonder worker per major pediatric facility in the country, Diane said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had thoroughly researched the scope of the need. Not employees, not contractors, but supported volunteers who could dedicate significant time to this work because their basic needs were being met through the foundation. The scope of the vision was breathtaking, but what impressed Robert most was how carefully Diane had considered his concerns about preserving authenticity. How would you ensure that the selection process identified the right people? That's where you come in, Diane said, her expression growing more animated. You would design the evaluation process. Not based on what people know, but on who they are. We'd look for individuals who naturally see children as whole people rather than problems to be solved, who understand that healing often happens through invitation rather than intervention. Dr. Peterson was taking notes rapidly. The hospital administration would support this completely. We've been struggling with pediatric trauma cases for years, and traditional approaches often fall short with children who have experienced significant medical crises. There's more, Diane continued, clearly building towards something. The foundation would also fund research, not into techniques or methodologies, but into understanding the conditions that allow for authentic healing relationships to develop. We document what works, but more importantly, we document why it works. Robert felt a stirring of excitement he hadn't expected. For years, he had worked in isolation, developing his approach through trial and error, learning from each child he encountered but having no way to share those insights beyond his own practice. The idea of being part of a community of people doing similar work, of contributing to a broader understanding of wonder-based healing, was deeply appealing. And the technology component, Robert asked, knowing that Diane's background would inevitably include some digital elements. Support tools only, Diane said firmly. Platforms for sharing insights between wonder workers, databases of techniques that have proven effective with specific types of trauma, communication systems that allow for consultation and collaboration. but nothing that would replace the human-to-human connection that makes this work. The three sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, each processing the implications of what Diane had outlined. The scope was ambitious, but the approach felt grounded in respect for the essential humanity of the work. "Mrs. Harrington," Robert said finally, "if I were to consider this, and I'm only saying if, what would be the first step?" Diane's eyes lit up, but she kept her voice measured. "A pilot program. We select 5 pediatric facilities, identify and train 5 wonder workers, and run a 6-month trial. We document everything. Not just outcomes, but processes, challenges, insights. We learn what works and what doesn't before we consider any kind of expansion." "And my role in this pilot?" "Lead trainer, program architect, and keeper of the philosophy," Diane said. "You would work with each selected candidate, help them develop their own authentic approach to the work, and ensure that we never lose sight of what actually matters." Robert thought of Victoria, of the dozens of other children he had worked with over the years, of all the children he couldn't reach because his impact was limited to Tuesday afternoons at a single hospital. The possibility of expanding that reach while preserving the integrity of the work was tantalizing. "I would need guarantees," Robert said slowly. "Written commitments that the work would never be commercialized, never be turned into a profit-generating enterprise. This has to remain about service, about healing, about authentic human connection." "Done," Diane said without hesitation. "The foundation will be structured specifically to prevent any kind of commercial exploitation." As Robert considered the proposal, he realized that his answer would determine not just his own future, but potentially the future of therapeutic care for traumatized children across the country. The weight of that responsibility was both humbling and inspiring. 6 months later, Robert stood in the gleaming conference room of the newly established Harrington Foundation for Wonder-Based Healing, surrounded by faces that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. The pilot program had exceeded every expectation, creating ripple effects that none of them had anticipated when they'd first gathered to discuss the seemingly impossible dream of scaling authentic human connection. The 5 wonder workers selected for the initial trial sat around the polished oak table, each representing a different pediatric facility and bringing their own unique gifts to the work. Sarah Chen worked at Boston Children's Hospital, where her background in music therapy had evolved into creating healing soundscapes that help children process trauma through rhythm and melody. Marcus Thompson had been placed at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where his gift for storytelling had transformed the way young patients understood their medical journeys. Elena Rodriguez brought her expertise in art therapy to Miami Children's Hospital, teaching children to express their fears and hopes through color and form. David Kim at Denver Children's Hospital specialized in what he called logic magic, puzzles and mathematical wonders that helped analytical children like Victoria regain their sense of agency through problem solving. Each had been selected not for their credentials, though all possessed relevant training, but for something deeper, an innate ability to see beyond the medical crisis to the whole child within, and a natural gift for creating the kind of authentic connection that invited healing rather than forcing it. The data is remarkable, Dr. Rachel Martinez, the Foundation's research director, announced as she pulled up presentation slides on the room's large screen. Across all 5 pilot sites, we're seeing average recovery times for pediatric trauma cases reduced by 40%, medication needs decreased by 30%, and most significantly, follow-up psychological evaluations showing marked improvement in long-term emotional resilience. Our case, Robert felt a mixture of pride and humility as he reviewed the statistics. They were impressive, but he knew the real measure of success wasn't captured in numbers. It was in the letters that arrived weekly from families whose children had been transformed by encounters with the Foundation's wonder workers. More importantly, Dr. Martinez continued, we're seeing systemic changes in how these hospitals approach pediatric care. Nursing staff report feeling more equipped to provide emotional support. Physicians are incorporating wonder-based techniques into their own patient interactions, and families are describing their hospital experiences in fundamentally different terms. Diane, who had thrown herself into the Foundation's work with the same intensity she had once reserved for corporate expansion, leaned forward with evident satisfaction. The demand for expansion has been overwhelming. We've received formal requests from 37 additional pediatric facilities and informal inquiries from over 100 more. The success had come with challenges Robert hadn't anticipated. Maintaining the authentic, relationship-centered approach that made the work effective while operating across multiple sites required constant vigilance. There had been early attempts by some facilities to rush the process, to treat wonderwork as just another therapeutic modality that could be scheduled and administered on a predetermined timeline. "We've learned some hard lessons," Robert acknowledged, addressing the room. "The program in Atlanta nearly failed because the hospital administration tried to integrate our work into their existing efficiency metrics. When Sarah's wonderworker there was given quotas for number of children seen per shift, the quality of connection suffered immediately." Sarah Chen nodded, her expression serious. "It's the difference between providing a service and creating a relationship. The moment we started measuring success by quantity rather than quality, children stopped responding authentically." This had led to one of the Foundation's most important innovations, the development of what they called sanctuary protocols. Each wonderworker was given absolute autonomy over their practice, protected from institutional pressure to compromise their approach for the sake of efficiency or standardization. "The breakthrough came," Elena Rodriguez added, "when we realized that we weren't just training wonderworkers, we were teaching entire medical communities how to create space for healing relationships to develop naturally." The pilot program had revealed that effective wonderwork required more than individual practitioners. It needed supportive ecosystems. Nurses had to understand why a wonderworker might spend an entire afternoon with a single child. Physicians needed to recognize that emotional healing often preceded or accelerated physical recovery. Hospital administrators had to embrace the reality that the most profound interventions often looked the least like traditional medical treatment. "Which brings us to the expansion proposal," Diane said, pulling up a new set of slides showing a map of the United States dotted with potential sites. "Based on what we've learned, I believe we are ready to move to Phase 2, 20 additional sites over the next 18 months. Robert studied the map, feeling the weight of responsibility that had become familiar over the past months. Each dot represented hundreds of children who could potentially benefit from wonder-based healing, but also the challenge of maintaining the integrity of the work as it scaled. "The selection process will be even more rigorous," he said, thinking through the implications. "We've learned that natural empathy and authentic presence are necessary but not sufficient. Candidates also need resilience, adaptability, and the wisdom to know when not to intervene." Marcus Thompson, whose work in Philadelphia had become legendary among the nursing staff, raised a crucial point. "We also need to address the emotional sustainability of the work. Connecting deeply with traumatized children, day after day, takes a psychological toll that traditional therapeutic training doesn't prepare you for." This had been one of the pilot program's most important discoveries. Wonder workers needed extensive support systems, not just technical training, but ongoing counseling, peer networks, and regular retreats where they could process their own emotional responses to the work. "The Foundation's support infrastructure will expand proportionally," Diane assured them. "Monthly virtual gatherings, quarterly in-person retreats, and 24-hour access to counseling services for all wonderworkers." David Kim leaned back in his chair, contemplating the scope of what they were discussing. "You know, 6 months ago, I thought we were just trying to help sick kids feel better. But what we've actually created is a new model for how healing institutions can operate. One that prioritizes authentic human connection alongside medical intervention." Robert nodded, recognizing the truth in David's observation. The Foundation had evolved beyond its original scope, becoming a catalyst for broader transformation in pediatric care. Hospitals participating in the pilot program reported improvements not just in patient outcomes, but in staff satisfaction, family engagement, and overall institutional culture. "The question before us," Robert said, looking around the table at the faces of people who had become both colleagues and friends, "is whether we're ready to take responsibility for that level of systemic change. Because that's what we're really talking about. Not just expanding a program, but transforming how an entire sector thinks about healing." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the magnitude of what they had accidentally created. What had begun as one man's simple desire to help traumatized children had evolved into a movement with the potential to reshape pediatric medicine itself. As Robert looked at the map of potential expansion sites, he thought of Victoria Harrington, whose transformation had started this entire journey. She would be starting middle school in the fall, her brilliant mind fully restored and her confidence stronger than ever. But her impact would ripple outward, through every child the foundation touched, every wonder worker they trained, every medical community they transformed. The magic, Robert realized, had been scalable after all, not by replicating techniques or systematizing approaches, but by creating conditions where authentic healing relationships could flourish naturally across an ever-widening network of care. 2 years had passed since that autumn afternoon when Robert Conklin first encountered a crying little girl with a broken heart, and the world of pediatric care had been quietly revolutionized in ways that defied easy measurement. The Harrington Foundation for Wonder-Based Healing now operated in 43 children's hospitals across North America, with a waiting list of facilities eager to join what had become known as the, quote, healing renaissance. Robert stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Foundation's new headquarters in downtown Seattle, watching the morning fog lift from Elliott Bay. The building itself reflected the evolution of their work, modern and efficient, but designed with children in mind. Soft lighting replaced harsh fluorescence, curved walls eliminated intimidating corners, and every surface that could be touched had been crafted from warm, natural materials that invited exploration rather than demanded sterility. The third annual Wonder Workers Convention was taking place in the building's main auditorium, bringing together 127 practitioners from across the continent. Each had been selected through Robert's increasingly sophisticated evaluation process, which had evolved to identify not just natural empathy and authentic presence, but the rare combination of resilience, wisdom, and what he had come to call healing intuition, the ability to sense exactly what each individual child needed to feel safe enough to begin their journey back to wholeness. "Robert," came a familiar voice behind him. He turned to find Dr. Sarah Chen, now the Foundation's Director of Training, approaching with a tablet full of data and a smile that carried the deep satisfaction of meaningful work. "The preliminary results from our longitudinal study are in. You're going to want to see this." The study had tracked 847 children who had received wonder-based intervention over the past 18 months, comparing their recovery trajectories with control groups receiving standard care. The numbers were impressive: reduced hospital stays, decreased long-term psychological complications, improved family satisfaction scores. But Robert had learned that the real magic happened in the spaces between statistics. "Show me the stories," Robert said, settling into one of the comfortable chairs scattered throughout the building's common areas. "The data is wonderful, but the stories are what matter." Sarah swiped through several screens until she found what she was looking for. "Listen to this letter from a mother in Portland. Before Marcus worked with my son, Timothy hadn't spoken since his surgery. The doctors said it could take months of therapy. But after one afternoon of what looked like simple play with blocks and puzzles, Timothy whispered his first word: wonder. He said the blocks had taught him that broken things could be built into something even more beautiful." Robert felt the familiar warmth that came with confirmation that their work was reaching its intended mark. Timothy's story wasn't unique. Wonder workers across the network regularly reported breakthroughs that seemed miraculous, but followed predictable patterns of trust building, agency restoration, and gradual re-engagement with the world. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice growing emotional. "A teenager in Vancouver who had been refusing all medical treatment for her chronic condition started participating in her own care after Elena helped her understand that managing illness could be a form of artistic expression. A 7-year-old in Boston who had been having daily panic attacks found peace through David's mathematical magic, learning that even scary things followed logical patterns she could understand and predict." The Foundation's approach had evolved far beyond Robert's original vision. Wonder workers now collaborated with medical teams from the moment of admission, integrating emotional healing into treatment plans rather than treating it as an afterthought. Nurses trained in basic wonder principles could identify children who might benefit from intervention. Physicians had learned to recognize when a child's physical symptoms were rooted in emotional trauma that required non-medical attention. "The ripple effects are the most remarkable part," Sarah said, pulling up another screen showing feedback from hospital staff. "Listen to this from a pediatric surgeon in Denver. Before the Foundation's program, my job was fixing broken bodies. Now I understand that I'm helping whole human beings heal. The wonder worker on our team has taught our entire surgical unit how to see our patients as brave adventurers rather than frightened victims." Through the windows, Robert could see families arriving for the afternoon's open house, an innovation that had emerged naturally as parents and children requested opportunities to stay connected with the wonder workers who had helped them through their medical crises. The Foundation's building buzzed with activity on these days, filled with laughter, demonstrations of magic tricks learned in hospital rooms, and the kind of joy that could only come from children who had rediscovered their own resilience. "Robert," came another voice, this one carrying the crisp authority he had come to associate with transformational leadership. Diane Harrington approached. But she looked different from the desperate corporate executive he had first met. Her expensive suits had been replaced by comfortable clothing suitable for sitting on floors with children, and her eyes held the deep satisfaction of someone whose resources were finally being used for their highest purpose. "Victoria asked me to give you this," Diane said, holding out an envelope decorated with hand-drawn rainbows and mathematical formulas. "She's presenting her science fair project on the physics of wonder at the state competition next week. She wanted you to know that her research was inspired by a question you asked her. What makes impossible things possible?" Robert opened the envelope carefully, revealing a photograph of Victoria standing beside an elaborate display about light refraction, optical illusions, and the neuroscience of surprise. She looked confident, brilliant, and completely healed, not just from her medical trauma, but grown beyond it into someone who understood that knowledge and wonder were complementary rather than contradictory forces. Her conclusion, Diane continued with obvious pride, is that impossible things become possible when someone cares enough to create the conditions where belief and curiosity can flourish together. She's planning to study both physics and psychology in college, with the goal of becoming what she calls a wonder scientist. As the afternoon progressed, Robert moved through the Foundation spaces, observing the informal magic happening everywhere. Wonder workers shared techniques with visiting families, children taught each other tricks they had learned during their hospital stays, and parents compared notes on how to maintain the sense of wonder their children had rediscovered through their medical journeys. In one corner, Marcus Thompson was working with a group of teenagers who had become peer mentors, teaching them how to create healing relationships with younger children facing similar medical challenges. Near the windows, Elena Rodriguez led an art therapy session where families created collaborative pieces representing their journeys from fear to hope. The Foundation had become more than an organization. It had evolved into a community united around the revolutionary idea that healing happened most effectively in environments where authentic human connection was valued as highly as medical expertise. As evening approached and the crowds began to disperse, Robert found himself back at the windows, watching the lights of Seattle begin to twinkle in the gathering dusk. The city looked the same as it had 2 years ago, but he knew that beneath its familiar surface, something fundamental had shifted. In hospitals across the continent, traumatized children were learning that they were braver than they knew, that healing was possible, and that the world still contained enough wonder to make hope worthwhile. The revolution had been quiet, spreading through hospital corridors and family conversations rather than headlines and boardrooms. But it was real, measurable in reduced trauma, accelerated healing, and the kind of institutional transformation that happened when organizations remembered that their ultimate purpose was serving human beings rather than processing cases. Robert thought of his daughter Emma, now 13 and volunteering at the Foundation's summer camps, teaching younger children the magic tricks her father had once used to help her through her own medical crisis. The circle was complete but never ending, each healed child potentially becoming a healer for others, each moment of wonder rippling outward into an ever-expanding network of possibility. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text message from a wonder worker in Toronto. 8-year-old with severe burns smiled for the first time today. Used the kaleidoscope technique you taught us. Magic is real, and it's spreadable. Robert smiled, understanding that what had begun as one man's desperate attempt to help traumatized children had evolved into something much larger. Proof that in a world increasingly dominated by technology and efficiency, there would always be room for the kind of healing that happened when one human being chose to see another's pain and respond with authentic care, creativity, and the unshakable belief that wonder could triumph over fear. The magic, it turned out, had been scalable after all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.